There is a photograph taken on the night of June 5th, 1968, inside the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. In it, Ethel Kennedy is crouched over her dying husband on the kitchen floor, 3 months pregnant, surrounded by chaos. She is looking at him. The world is falling apart around her, and she is looking at him. That image, that single moment, tells you almost everything you need to know about the sad story of Ethel Kennedy, the widow left behind by history, a girl from Greenwich. To understand Ethel Kennedy, you have to go back to Greenwich, Connecticut, in the 1930s. That's where she grew up. Not in some modest house on a quiet street, but in a 31-room English country manor on Lake Avenue, surrounded by 6 siblings, a rotating cast of animals, and a family that treated life as a full-contact sport. She was born Ethel Skakel on April 11th, 1928, in Chicago, Illinois, the 6th of 7 children. Her father, George Skakel, had started from almost nothing, an $8 a week railroad clerk who, through sheer determination, built a small coal and coke business into the Great Lakes Carbon Corporation, a sprawling energy enterprise that eventually made the family extraordinarily wealthy. Her mother, Anne Brannock Skakel, was a devout Catholic who passed her faith and her love of organized chaos down to every one of her children. The Skakel household was not a quiet place. It was loud, physical, and competitive in the way only large families with too much energy and too much space can be. The family relocated east when Ethel was 5, settling into Greenwich for good by 1936. The house was enormous, the family even more so. There were horses, dogs, chickens, and any number of creatures that seemed to find their way into the Skakel orbit. The children were loud, competitive, and deeply loyal to one another. Discipline was not exactly a house specialty. Ethel, in particular, was a free spirit, tomboyish, pranking, fiercely competitive, and completely unafraid of authority. She once described herself as someone who always wanted to be doing something, anything, rather than sitting still. She was not built for stillness. She attended the all-girls Greenwich Academy and then the Convent of the Sacred Heart in the Bronx, graduating in 1945. The nuns did their best. Ethel remained thoroughly herself. That fall, she enrolled at Manhattanville College in New York, where fate arranged something that would change her life entirely. She was assigned a roommate, a girl named Jean Kennedy, daughter of Joseph and Rose Kennedy of Massachusetts. The two became fast friends almost immediately, drawn together by their shared Catholicism, their love of competition, and a mutual talent for getting their names written in the demerit book. Once, memorably, for disorder in the tea room. The demerit book itself eventually disappeared. It had been stolen and incinerated, and no one seemed to know exactly who was responsible. It was Jean who brought Ethel into the Kennedy world, and it was at a ski trip to Mont Tremblant Resort in Quebec in December 1945 that Ethel first encountered Jean's brother, Robert. She was 17 years old. He was standing in front of a roaring fireplace, she would later recall in a 2012 documentary. And there was something about the way he commanded the room without seeming to try. She noticed him immediately. The problem was, he wasn't interested in Ethel, not yet. He began dating her older sister, Patricia. For 2 years, Ethel watched from the sidelines while the man she had fallen for was in a relationship with her own sister. She would later describe it as a black period. Not in an angry way, but with the kind of rueful honesty that came naturally to her. When Robert and Patricia went their separate ways, and when Robert turned his attention toward Ethel, she had been waiting long enough. She did not hesitate. They became engaged in February 1950. They were married on June 17th, 1950, at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Greenwich, Connecticut, in a Catholic ceremony attended by hundreds of guests. The Boston Globe noted that the wedding unites two large fortunes. But for Ethel, what it united was something far more personal. She had married the person she wanted, the person she had been watching since that ski lodge fireplace 5 years earlier. She was 22 years old, and she was certain. She would be certain about him for the rest of her life. The making of a Kennedy. The early years of marriage were happy in the way that all-consuming, full-speed lives can be happy, busy, purposeful, and always pointed forward. Robert finished his law degree at the University of Virginia, and the couple settled in the Washington, D.C. area, where he went to work at the Justice Department. Children came quickly, almost reliably, year after year. Kathleen was born on July 4th, 1951. Joseph followed in 1952, Robert Jr. in 1954, David in 1955. For Ethel, motherhood and political engagement were not separate things. She dove into both with the same undivided, somewhat overwhelming energy. In 1952, she organized tea parties for Massachusetts voters to support John Kennedy's Senate campaign, greeting strangers, making them feel like old friends, moving around a room in a way that seemed effortless but was anything but. Without question, she is the best campaigner I've ever seen, her daughter Kathleen would say decades later. At fundraisers, she instinctively noticed the few people who were undecided and would go up to them and charm them. It was a gift that looked like personality, but it was also a skill, honed through years of watching, caring, and paying attention. In October 1955, the world shifted for Ethel in a way it had never quite shifted before. Both of her parents, George and Anne Skakel, were killed when their private plane crashed in Union City, Oklahoma. She had 4 children at home and another on the way. She grieved privately, as she would grieve everything, by pressing forward, staying busy, refusing to let sorrow become the center of the room. The world required things. She gave them. A year later, the Kennedys made a purchase that would define the next 5 decades of Ethel's life. In 1956, Robert bought Hickory Hill, a 13-bedroom Georgian estate on 6 acres in McLean, Virginia, from his brother John and John's wife, Jacqueline, who had returned to Georgetown after Jackie suffered a miscarriage. The house was enormous, slightly battered, and almost immediately transformed into something that defied easy description. Hickory Hill, under Ethel Kennedy, was unlike any house in Washington, and Washington has seen a lot of houses. A regular visitor once described it as a wild, informal mixture of a children's playground, upbeat discotheque, and a humming political headquarters. Animals were everywhere: horses, dogs, chickens, geese, goats. Robert Jr. collected reptiles and kept a turtle in the laundry room. At one point, a sea lion took up residence in the swimming pool. There was, at various times, a wandering armadillo that broke up afternoon tea parties, and a pet hawk that once landed directly on a politician's wife's wig, to considerable alarm and Ethel's barely concealed satisfaction. The children kept coming. Courtney in 1956, Michael in 1958, Kerry in 1959, Christopher in 1963, and still the house ran, or something that resembled running. The estate hosted John Glenn and Arthur Schlesinger and Gene Kelly and Robert Frost. When Frost came to dinner, Ethel handed out paper and pencils to all the guests and held a poetry writing contest. When Harry Belafonte came, he taught the twist on the dance floor, the Hickory Hill Seminars, organized by historian Arthur Schlesinger at Robert's request, brought scientists, philosophers, writers, and government officials together for evenings of dinner, drinks, and serious conversation. They were grilled, as one of Robert's old law school friends put it, with 1,001 questions. John Glenn was asked what it felt like to be weightless while orbiting Earth. He answered. Then he was asked again, from another angle. The Hickory Hill parties were something of a Washington institution. Invitations were coveted across the city's social and political circles. The guest lists were extraordinary. Senators, cabinet members, astronauts, artists, all mixed together in the same rooms, spilling out onto the lawns. The highlight, more often than not, was watching some impeccably dressed Washington official end up in the swimming pool, fully clothed, because that was the kind of place Ethel ran. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. got pushed in once, to the obvious discomfort of Jacqueline Kennedy, who found the whole spectacle somewhat beneath the occasion. Ethel thought it was marvelous. Bobby was occasionally short with guests who dropped a pass in the legendary touch football games. Ethel, according to at least one witness, was known to bite people on the ankle when things got sufficiently competitive. The Washington Post, in 1962, offered a portrait of her life that managed to be both affectionate and slightly dazzled. Petite and peppy Ethel, who doesn't look one bit the outdoorsy type, considers outdoor activity so important for the children that she has arranged her busy cabinet wife schedule so she can personally take them on 2 daily outings. 2 daily outings. 11 children eventually. A 13-bedroom house full of animals. A husband who would call from the office to announce he was bringing 20 people for lunch. Robert, meanwhile, was rising through American public life. He had served as chief counsel to the Senate Select Committee beginning in 1957, taking on organized crime with a seriousness that earned him respect and powerful enemies. He was appointed Attorney General when his brother John won the presidency in 1960, a controversial choice that drew accusations of nepotism, which Robert absorbed without apparent concern. The Kennedy administration brought Ethel fully into the center of the country's political world. She was everywhere, campaigning, hosting, supporting, always moving. Then November 22nd, 1963, arrived. Ethel was at home at Hickory Hill when the phone rang. She picked it up. The caller identified himself as J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI. A man who had never called the Attorney General's home before. She handed the phone to Robert and watched his face change. He told her. The president had been shot in Dallas. John Kennedy died that day. Robert was never the same again. The grief changed him visibly. He grew more serious, more drawn, more interested in the suffering of people he might not have noticed before. He kept a worn copy of the Greek tragedians on his nightstand. He travelled to the poorest parts of America and came back different each time. Neither, in certain ways, was Ethel the same, though she showed it differently. Where Robert retreated into private grief, Ethel remained outwardly steady, holding the household together, insisting on forward motion. She was not denying the loss. She simply believed, with the full force of her faith, that collapsing was not an option when 10 children were looking at you. The campaign and the night. Everything ended. By 1964, Robert had decided to run for the United States Senate, representing New York. He was accused of carpetbagging. He had never lived in New York. And Ethel, in her characteristically wry way, suggested the campaign slogan, "There is only so much you can do for Massachusetts." He won. She had been right again. The Senate years were good years, in the sense that they had direction and purpose. Robert traveled to some of the poorest places in America, to the Mississippi Delta, to the hollows of Appalachia, to the migrant labor camps of California, where Cesar Chavez was organizing farm workers, and came back from each trip more altered, more certain that the country needed to reckon with things it had been looking away from. Ethel traveled with him whenever she could. She saw what he saw. She had grown up Republican. in a wealthy household that had little reason to think much about poverty. But those years changed her completely. The politics she held in the mid-1960s were entirely her own, forged by things she had witnessed firsthand. In September 1966, her brother George was killed when a light plane crashed in a canyon in central Idaho during an elk hunting trip. Grief layered on top of grief. Douglas, their 10th child, was born the following March in 1967. And yet Ethel kept going, kept hosting, kept campaigning, kept pushing Robert toward the decision she was more convinced of than he was. It was Ethel who pushed hardest for him to enter the presidential race. His biographer, Evan Thomas, called her his most consistent advocate of a race for the White House. She never doubted it. While Robert agonized over the decision, concerned about what it might do to the country, to the Democratic Party, to his family, Ethel organized the children. At Hickory Hill, in the midst of tense discussions about whether he should run, the older kids unfurled a banner from an upstairs window that read, "Kennedy for President," while the record player downstairs blasted "The Impossible Dream." Ethel had arranged the whole thing. Robert looked up at it, and the argument was effectively over. He announced his candidacy on March 16, 1968. The campaign was 85 days long. Ethel, again pregnant, this time 3 months along with their 11th child, traveled with him almost everywhere, accompanied by staff who helped manage the campaign demands alongside the children, who were often present as well. She had always been terrified of flying. She flew anyway. She was beside him at rally after rally, state after state, waving from the back of motorcades as the crowds grew and the energy built around what was beginning to feel like something real. During the Indiana primary, Robert spoke of Ethel from the podium, saying she had made such a major difference in this campaign and a major difference for me. He meant it. She had always been his most reliable source of clarity and forward momentum, the person who believed in what they were doing when doubt crept in. On June 4th, 1968, Robert Kennedy won the California Democratic primary. The victory speech he gave to a ballroom full of supporters at the Ambassador Hotel was filled with a particular lightness, an optimism that had not always come easily during the campaign. The crowd was electric. Ethel was standing near him as always, 3 months pregnant, watching. Just after midnight on June 5th, as the group made its way through the hotel's kitchen corridor, the back route toward a waiting press gathering, a young man named Sirhan stepped forward and fired a pistol. Several shots were fired. Robert Kennedy was hit. He went down. Ethel, who had been walking directly beside her husband, crouched over him on the floor. She whispered to him while the chaos erupted around them, the screaming, the surging crowd, the confusion of a room that had just become a crime scene. She stayed right there, next to him, calm in the way only people with a very deep foundation can be calm. She turned to the crowd, pressing in, and pushed them back, asked them to give him air. Photographs from those moments show her face. Not empty, not gone. Present. Completely present. He was transported to the Hospital of the Good Samaritan and went into surgery. He died the following day, on June 6, 1968, at 42 years old. Ethel Kennedy was 40 years old. She was 3 months pregnant. She had 10 children at home. In a single night, the history she had been living inside, the big, loud, chaotic, remarkable history of the Kennedys, of Washington, of the country's long 1960s, handed her a weight that no one should ever have to carry alone. The widow. The weeks after Robert's death were a kind of extended public ceremony of grief that Ethel was expected to endure, even as she was privately devastated. The world was watching. His body lay in state at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. Hundreds of thousands of people filed past. A train then carried his casket from New York to Washington, D.C., and all along the tracks, people gathered, workers, neighbors, families who had driven to the rail lines simply to stand and watch the train go by, as if presence was the only tribute left. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, near the grave of his brother John, on a hillside under the stars. Ethel returned to Hickory Hill. She had 10 children and a pregnancy, and a house full of animals, and a staff that was doing its best. She had money, and extended family, and the goodwill of nearly every powerful figure in Washington. She had none of the things that had actually made the house a home. The person who had been at the center of everything, the one who had called to say he was bringing 20 people for lunch, the one who had asked all the questions and cared about the answers. She made a vow that she would keep for the rest of her life. She would not remarry. The vow was grounded in her Catholic faith, but it was also something more fundamental, a refusal to treat Robert as a chapter that could be closed and moved on from. He was not a chapter. He was everything that had mattered, and she was going to live in honor of that, rather than in spite of it. She retreated into Hickory Hill for much of 1968. In December of that year, she gave birth to their final child, a daughter they had already planned to name Rory. Rory Kennedy was born 6 months after her father was killed. She would grow up in a house full of photographs and stories about a man she never got to meet, raised by a mother who was simultaneously holding together a family and a grief that never fully lifted. A 1969 Gallup poll named Ethel Kennedy the country's most admired woman. She had appeared almost nowhere publicly. She had given no interviews. She had offered the world very little to go on, and still the country had made its assessment. She was remarkable, even if it could not quite say why. Time magazine noted in its April 1969 cover story that the admiration was born of sympathy, not knowledge. The public does not know her today. Perhaps it never did. Those who did know her described something quite different. Not a fragile widow, but a woman of unusual strength. Her grief was real and bottomless, but she processed it in the only way she knew, by continuing, by getting the children to school, by making sure dinner happened, by refusing, at least outwardly, to let sorrow become the gravitational center of the house. A Time profile from that same year drew a now famous comparison to Jacqueline Kennedy. Jackie has traced an aesthetic arc of grief, ending with a stylish whirl into another world. Ethel's special triumph has been to maintain normalcy. She has simply carried on, as best she could, the kind of existence that Bobby would have pursued had he lived. That normalcy was not accidental. It was chosen, every day, against the pull of everything that had happened. Within months of Robert's death, while still pregnant with Rory, she helped found the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights. She did this in the autumn of 1968, at the low point of everything, when most people would have been incapable of organizing a dinner party, let alone a non-profit organization. The center was dedicated to carrying forward his commitments to human rights, to social justice, to the advocacy of those the world preferred not to see. It would become one of the most respected organizations of its kind in the country, and Ethel remained connected to it for the rest of her life. New York Senator Jacob Javits, who had known her for years, said without pause that she was the greatest of the Kennedys, male or female. Harry Belafonte, who had watched her from close range for a long time, wrote in his memoirs, "Of all the Kennedy women, she was the one I would end up admiring the most. She wasn't play acting. She looked at you and immediately got what you were about, raising the clan alone." The 1970s at Hickory Hill were, by nearly all accounts, a three-ring circus. Ethel was raising 11 children by herself, the youngest barely a toddler, the oldest already heading into adulthood, with household help, but without the person who had always been the gravitational center. Friends who visited over those years described a household where anything could happen, where the line between the animals and the children was sometimes difficult to locate, where servants quit regularly because the disorder exceeded what any reasonable person had signed up for, and where Ethel moved through it all with a kind of frenetic, determined energy that kept the whole thing from completely unraveling. She was not a soft mother. Those who knew the family well have said she was loving but demanding, private in her own grief, in a way that sometimes left the children to navigate theirs without much guidance. The loss of Robert had hit the boys especially hard, and in the absence of his presence, several of them struggled in serious ways. Robert Jr. battled drug addiction for years. David Kennedy, the fourth child, who had been 13 years old and actually in the corridor of the Ambassador Hotel on the night his father was shot, carried that night with him for the rest of his life and was never able to put it down. Ethel sent David to rehab programs repeatedly over the years, employed a live-in specialist to help manage his struggles, and did everything she could think of. None of it was enough. On April 25, 1984, David Kennedy was found dead in a hotel room in Palm Beach, Florida, about 7 weeks before what would have been his 29th birthday. The cause was an accidental overdose involving a combination of drugs, including cocaine. Ethel did not collapse in public. She told friends she believed David had gone to be with his father in heaven. There was a private funeral at Hickory Hill, and he was buried in the family plot in Brookline, Massachusetts. 13 years later, on New Year's Day, 1998, tragedy arrived again. Her son Michael, her sixth child, 39 years old, died in a skiing accident in Aspen, Colorado on New Year's Eve of 1997. He had been playing a skiing version of touch football with family members on the slopes when he lost control and struck a tree. He died that evening. 2 sons, 2 decades apart. Former New York Governor Mario Cuomo, whose son Andrew was then married to Ethel's daughter Kerry, said after Michael's death that it was probably harder in Ethel's life than anyone else's to find the evidence that God is good. He added, "Yet she believes it." He also said something that rang true to everyone who knew her. "I suspect when she's at Mass and alone in a pew that she allows herself a tear. But she won't allow herself a tear with you. She doesn't make her problem your problem." The accumulation of loss in her life was, by any measure, almost incomprehensible. By the time Michael died, she had lost her parents, 2 brothers, a brother-in-law president, a husband, and now 2 of her own children. And she had done all of it in public, under the watch of a country that seemed to regard the Kennedy family as a kind of American mythology it could never quite stop reading. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, Ethel's friendship with singer Andy Williams attracted regular attention from gossip columns and tabloids. Williams had been close to both Robert and Ethel during the 1960s and began accompanying her to public events after Robert's death. Speculation about the nature of their relationship followed them for years. When Williams's own marriage to actress Claudine Longet ended in divorce, the rumors intensified. Both Williams and Ethel maintained they were close friends, and nothing more. He eventually married someone else, and they remained friends until his death in 2012. Other names were linked to hers over the years: football player Frank Gifford, New York politician Hugh Carey. But Ethel never wavered from her vow. She did not remarry. She cited her Catholic faith when pressed, but it was more than faith. It was intention, a life in service. As the children grew, and the chaos at Hickory Hill slowly gave way to something quieter, Ethel Kennedy turned more fully to the public work she had started in the darkest months of 1968. The Robert F. Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights became one of the most respected human rights organizations in the country. It gave annual awards to journalists, activists, and advocates who had made significant contributions to human rights causes around the world, people who had put themselves at genuine risk for principles that mattered. It funded programs supporting rights defenders in countries where that work came with real danger. Ethel remained the founding force behind it and stayed connected to the organization's work until the very end of her life. Her daughter Kerry became its president, carrying forward the work in her own right. Several of Ethel's other children also entered public life in ways that reflected what they had seen their father believe in. Kathleen served as Lieutenant Governor of Maryland. Joseph represented Massachusetts in Congress. Christopher ran for governor of Illinois, and Max worked as a prosecutor in Philadelphia. The Kennedy tradition continued, rooted in things Ethel had insisted on, even when it would have been entirely understandable to let the whole thing go. She threw herself into other causes as well: migrant workers' rights, Native American rights, environmental protection, gun control. She co-chaired the Coalition of Gun Control in the years following her husband's assassination, one of the founding voices of what would become a long national debate: the Earth Conservation Corps, the Special Olympics, the Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration Project in Brooklyn, a community development initiative Robert had cared about deeply in his final years, and which she continued supporting long after his name stopped automatically opening every door. She did not limit herself to lending her name to causes. She showed up. In April 2008, at age 80, she traveled to Indianapolis on the 40th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to honor a monument commemorating King's death and the speech Robert had given that night in 1968. A speech that was credited with preventing riots from breaking out in that city. In 2016, at 88, she appeared in person at a demonstration in Florida in support of higher wages for farm workers. In 2018, at 90, she participated in a hunger strike protesting the Trump administration's immigration policies at the southern border. In 2008, she publicly endorsed Barack Obama for the Democratic presidential nomination, joining Ted Kennedy and Caroline Kennedy in making it a family declaration, and hosted a fundraiser at Hickory Hill priced at $28,500 a plate, raising approximately $6 million in one evening. She said Obama reminded her of Robert. That was not something she said lightly, and everyone in the room knew it. President Obama awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom in November 2014, the highest civilian honor in the country. At the White House ceremony, with her children in the audience, he said she was an emblem of enduring faith and enduring hope, even in the face of unimaginable loss and unimaginable grief, and that she had touched the lives of countless people around the world with her generosity and grace. She was 86 years old, and she received the medal with the directness and economy of motion that had always characterized her. No excess, no performance, just presence. In 2013, she stood between Obama and Bill Clinton at Arlington National Cemetery on the 50th anniversary of John Kennedy's assassination, each of them holding one of her hands as they climbed the steps to lay a wreath at JFK's grave. It was a moment that had 50 years of history behind it. In 2021, at 93, she wrote to the California Parole Board opposing the release of Sirhan Sirhan, who had been recommended for parole for the first time. She wrote that Bobby had wanted to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of the world, and that the person who had ended his life should not be given the opportunity to threaten others again. 6 of her surviving children signed their names alongside hers. The parole recommendation was ultimately rejected by the governor. She sold Hickory Hill in December 2009 for $8.25 million, ending more than half a century of Kennedy presence on those 6 acres in McLean, Virginia. In her later years, she divided her time between the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport, Massachusetts, and a home in Palm Beach, Florida. In 2012, Rory's documentary Ethel premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, and for the first time, Ethel allowed herself to be the subject of the story. When the film brought up the night of the assassination, she started a sentence. "When we lost Daddy," and stopped. She looked down. She asked Rory to talk about something else. Even then, 44 years later, some doors stayed mostly closed. The end. On October 3rd, 2024, Ethel Kennedy suffered a stroke in her sleep. She was 96 years old. She was hospitalized in Boston and received care over the following week. Her grandson, Joe Kennedy III, posted on social media to let the family's followers know what had happened, describing her as a strong woman who had lived a remarkably full life. On October 10th, 2024, she died from complications of the stroke. Joe Kennedy III announced her passing. "It is with our hearts full of love that we announce the passing of our amazing grandmother, Ethel Kennedy," he wrote. Along with a lifetime's work in social justice and human rights, our mother leaves behind 9 children, 34 grandchildren, and 24 great-grandchildren, along with numerous nieces and nephews, all of whom love her dearly. She had outlived 2 of her 11 children. She had outlived her husband by 56 years. She had outlived the whole era she belonged to, the new frontier, the Kennedy administration, the hope and grief spiral of the 1960s. And she had kept showing up anyway, decade after decade, in rooms where she believed things could still be made better. Her funeral was held 4 days later at Our Lady of Victory Church in Centerville, Massachusetts. On October 16th, a memorial service was held at the Roman Catholic Cathedral of St. Matthew the Apostle in Washington, D.C. President Joe Biden delivered a eulogy. So did former Presidents Barack Obama and Bill Clinton. Biden, who had known her for more than 50 years, said she had a spine of steel and a heart of gold. He said she had taught him and his own family, after the loss of his wife and daughter, how to channel grief into service of something larger. Obama's remarks were warmer and less formal, the words of a man who had known her, not just known of her. She was buried, as she had always intended, reunited with Robert. What history forgot. History has a tendency to organize itself around the people it can most easily explain. John Kennedy was the golden president, the handsome, witty man who seemed to represent something America wanted to believe about itself. Jacqueline Kennedy was the grieving widow turned icon, the woman who defined how to carry loss with elegance. Robert Kennedy was the hope that died in a hotel kitchen, the candidate who might have changed everything and didn't get the chance to try. And Ethel was the woman standing next to him, crouched on the floor of that kitchen corridor, whispering to her dying husband while the world fell apart around her. 3 months pregnant, 10 children at home. She doesn't fit cleanly into any of the roles history tends to assign. She was not the most glamorous of the Kennedy women. She was not the most articulate in interviews. She spent decades actively avoiding the spotlight that the rest of her family could not escape. She chose to be the one holding things together behind the scenes, rather than the one standing in front of cameras explaining what everything meant. She raised 11 children alone. She founded a human rights organization in the months before she gave birth to her last child. She buried 2 sons and kept going. She buried a husband and kept going. She kept going through grief that compounded on top of grief, year after year, decade after decade, until the whole accumulation of it would have seemed almost biblical if you wrote it down in a list. She never remarried. She never stopped working. She never stopped showing up in rooms where she believed things could still be made better, even at 90 years old, even at a protest, even when it would have been completely understandable to finally stay home. She is not the easiest person to fit into a sentence. She was not, as one profile noted during her lifetime, built for introspection. She disliked it, deflected it, moved around it. When asked about her pain, she would change the subject or look away. She organized her life around action rather than reflection, around the next thing that needed doing rather than the things already done and already mourned. That was, perhaps, the only way she knew to survive it. Senator Jacob Javits of New York said she was the greatest of the Kennedys. Harry Belafonte said she was the Kennedy woman he ended up admiring most. Rory Kennedy, the daughter born 6 months after the assassination, the one who made the documentary, said her mother's life was one of the great untold stories. Her daughter-in-law once described the losses as never-ending and unimaginable, and yet Ethel never presented it that way to the world. She kept the weight of it private, held it close, and walked forward anyway. She lived 96 years. She was there for the new frontier and the Great Society, and the march of civil rights, and the women's movement, and the environmental movement, and the turn of the century, and the digital age, and a country that kept changing around her while she kept working to make it a little better than it was. She carried loss that would have broken most people in the first decade of it, and she spent the remaining years being exactly who she had decided to be. Not a widow, not a footnote, not a woman defined entirely by the night everything ended, but someone who had chosen, again and again, to keep going. History moved past her, as it tends to do, but she never really let it. If this story moved you, please give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep making stories like this one. There are many more lives worth remembering. People who were there for the extraordinary moments of the 20th century. People history tends to overlook. People who deserve more than a footnote. We'll keep telling them. See you in the next one. Somewhere in New York City, on the 11th floor of Beth Israel Medical Center, a woman spent her days watching cartoons, arranging dolls, and occasionally chatting in French with the one nurse she trusted. Outside her window, the city moved at its usual speed. Cabs, crowds, noise, life. She never looked out. She kept the shades drawn. Her name was Huguette Clark. She was one of the wealthiest women in America. She owned 3 grand estates she never visited, a 42-room apartment overlooking Central Park she hadn't set foot in for years, and a fortune worth hundreds of millions of dollars she barely touched. She had checked herself into that hospital room in 1991. She never left. The part that has always stuck with people, the part that still doesn't quite make sense, is that she wasn't sick. She wasn't frail or confused. She was, by most accounts, sharp, funny, and perfectly lucid. She just didn't want to go home. What happened to Huguette Clark is not a simple story. It starts over a century ago, in a Paris apartment, with a father who controlled copper empires and a little girl who loved dolls. And it ends in a hospital bed, 2 weeks before her 105th birthday, with almost no one by her side who shared her blood. The story of how she got from one to the other is the part worth knowing. Segment 10. The Copper King, the fortune that started it all. To understand Huguette Clark, you first have to understand her father, because what William Andrews Clark built set the terms of her entire life before she was old enough to have opinions of her own. Clark was born in 1839 in Pennsylvania. and made his way west during the mining rushes. He figured out early that the fastest way to profit from a gold rush is to sell things to the miners, not dig alongside them. He bought eggs at market price and sold them back to Montana miners at many times that. He found profit in every corner of the frontier. But the real money came from copper. In Butte, Montana, Clark recognized before almost anyone else that the coming electrical age would need copper wire, and Butte sat on one of the richest deposits on Earth. He built mines, smelters, railroads, and assembled one of the most powerful industrial empires in the country. At his peak, he was the second richest man in America, behind only John D. Rockefeller. Mark Twain wrote about Clark in terms that left nothing to the imagination, placing him among the most corrupt figures in American public life. He was notorious for 1899, when he reportedly distributed envelopes of cash to Montana state legislators to secure his election to the United States Senate. The scandal forced him to resign before being seated. He eventually returned to the Senate. But the story followed him. He was a man who believed money could buy essentially anything. On Fifth Avenue in New York City, he built a mansion so excessive even the Gilded Age found it remarkable. 121 rooms, multiple art galleries, a private theatre, marble staircases, and an underground coal railway. It cost approximately $7 million. New Yorkers called it Clark's Folly. He had been snubbed by the social elite and responded by building something they couldn't ignore. This was the man who, at 67, became a father for the last time. His second wife was Anna LaChapelle, born in 1878, the daughter of French-Canadian immigrants. She had come into Clark's orbit as a young woman after her own father's death, described in accounts of the time as having been his ward. They married secretly in France in 1901, a union that became public in 1904 and drew scrutiny given the 39-year age difference. Together, they had two daughters, Andrée, born in 1902, and Huguette Marcel Clark, born June 9, 1906, in Paris. The name came from the street where they kept their Paris apartment, the Avenue Victor Hugo, a world of gilded rooms, European tutors, and violin lessons. Absolute privilege, but more fragile than it appeared. The first cracks came from the one place all that money couldn't protect against. Segment 9. A Sister and a Shadow. The Loss That Never Healed. Huguette Clark was 5 years old when the family moved from Paris to New York City in 1911. The life she entered was extraordinary. Art galleries filled with Renoir, Degas, Monet, Cézanne, a staff of dozens, a floor kept in reserve against epidemic. And yet, for all the marble and all the paintings, what mattered most to young Huguette was far simpler: her older sister. Andrée Clark was 4 years older, and the two girls were inseparable. They shared a bedroom in the 121-room mansion, a detail that says more than any description could. Huguette was already shy by temperament, preferring quiet play to any kind of public performance. Andrée was her anchor. In 1919, Andrée Clark fell ill with meningitis. She was 16 years old, just days from her 17th birthday. She died. Huguette was 13. The effect was not something that resolved over time. In the family's Santa Barbara estate, Bello Sguardo, portraits of Andrée hung in nearly every room, sometimes two to a room, her deep-set eyes following you through the house. The bird refuge Huguette funded in Santa Barbara in 1928 was named the Andrée Clark Bird Refuge. A cottage on the property bore her name. A summer camp in Briarcliff Manor, New York, donated by her parents in Andrée's memory, was called Camp Andrée Clark. Huguette spent decades keeping her sister's name attached to permanent things as if permanence could prevent the person from disappearing entirely. Her father was in his 80s when André died, elderly and distant in the ways that matter most. In 1925, William Andrews Clark died of pneumonia in his Fifth Avenue house at the age of 86. Huguette was 18. Before he went, he had told her something she never forgot, that the fortune she would inherit meant she could never be entirely sure of the people around her. No one would truly love her, he said. She had to be careful. It was a cruel thing to tell a teenager who had already lost her sister. It was also, coming from a man who had bought his Senate seat, a statement of his own experience. Huguette and her mother Anna moved to an apartment at 907 Fifth Avenue. The mansion was demolished in 1927. What remained was the money, the art, the properties, and two women who had learned to be each other's primary company. The shape of what Huguette's life would eventually become was already visible. But there was still one more chapter to get through first. A marriage that was brief, strange, and would leave its own marks. Segment 8. The Marriage That Wasn't. William Gower and the Beginning of Withdrawal. In December 1927, the Society pages of New York announced the engagement of Huguette Clark to William MacDonald Gower, a Princeton graduate, a law student, and the son of one of William Andrews Clark's longtime business associates. On paper, a sensible match. They were married on August 18, 1928, at Bellosguardo, the Clark estate in Santa Barbara. Huguette was 22. The marriage lasted less than a year before the couple separated. They divorced in Reno, Nevada, on August 11, 1930. The filing cited desertion. But more came out around the time of the proceedings. Gower's account was that the marriage had never been consummated. Some accounts suggested that Anna, Huguette's mother, had effectively paid Gower a substantial sum to marry her daughter in the first place. Whether entirely accurate or partially embellished, the picture that emerged was of a marriage that had been a transaction from the start, with an emotional foundation that was never really there. Huguette did not grieve its end. She returned to 907 Fifth Avenue, expanded the apartment to nearly 2 full floors and 42 rooms, and stayed. The last confirmed photograph of her dates to around 1930. A composed young woman in a dress that suggests someone dressing carefully for an occasion they're not entirely comfortable with. After that, the photographic record simply stops. She was 24 when the divorce was finalized. She never married again. The 1930s and 1940s brought some remaining social life, painting lessons, the occasional Dior show attended specifically to find inspiration for her dolls' wardrobes. But the direction was already set. She was retreating. Not dramatically, not all at once. Steadily, incrementally, the way a tide goes out. Her constant companion was her mother. Anna and Huguette became almost a closed system. Two women in a vast apartment, living in French, their world growing quieter with each passing year. When that world was occasionally disturbed, it pushed Huguette further inward. And one particular disturbance, in the early 1940s, marked a turning point from which she never quite recovered. Segment 7. The World Outside. Shadows and the Slow Disappearance. The 1940s brought disruptions that a woman already inclined toward seclusion found difficult to manage. Huguette had a genuine and deep love of Japanese art and culture. She collected Japanese dolls, studied Japanese history, and built connections to Japanese artists. In the period of intense wartime suspicion following Pearl Harbor, that connection attracted official attention. The FBI conducted an interrogation regarding her ties to Japan. The exact details are not fully documented, but the effect on Huguette was significant. Some accounts describe the experience as contributing to a breakdown. a period of severe strain that deepened her distrust of the outside world and her reluctance to engage with it. Through the 1950s, she still visited Bellosguardo regularly, the Santa Barbara estate her mother Anna had rebuilt in the 1930s. 27 rooms of French Riviera design, set on 23 oceanfront acres. She painted in her studio, walked the grounds. The last visit she made to Bellosguardo was in 1953. She was 47 years old. She never went back. Her social life by this point had reduced to a particular kind of minimum. She attended Christian Dior fashion shows, not for herself, but to find inspiration for her dolls' wardrobes. When the French consul general spotted her name on the guest list for one show, he told a Dior representative she wouldn't come. She never went out, he said. She was his aunt by marriage, and she was a recluse. The representative corrected him. She came for the dolls. Her relationship with the dolls was not a symptom of disorder. It was an art practice, a form of focused engagement with beauty on her own terms. She commissioned elaborate miniature Japanese theatre sets, directed their arrangement with precision through written instructions to her assistant, and owned pieces ranging from antique French bisque dolls worth tens of thousands of dollars each to Barbie dolls and Smurfs figurines. When asked about this later, her personal assistant, Christopher Sattler, made the point that no one questioned Jay Leno for owning several hundred automobiles. The collecting impulse was not strange. The tenderness and specificity with which Huguette pursued it made it something close to its own private world. She was also a serious painter. She had studied with Tadeusz Steicher, a renowned Polish portrait painter, and exhibited her work at the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington in 1929, and later in Paris. People who saw her paintings described genuine talent, precision, and emotional depth that went well beyond the achievements of a wealthy amateur, but all of it took place inside. And in 1963, the last remaining connection Huguette had to any daily human intimacy disappeared. Segment 6. Alone in the Gilded Cage. The years after her mother. Anna Clark died in 1963 at the age of 85. Huguette was 57 years old. The effect was immediate and total. People who had known Huguette in any capacity during the years before her mother's death noted afterward that something had simply closed. She became, in the truest sense, a recluse. Not just private, not just selective about company, but genuinely withdrawn from the world in a way that had no exceptions. She was not seen outside her apartment again. The few visitors who had occasionally been permitted, a goddaughter, a distant family member, a trusted employee, were gradually phased out. Her staff at the apartment were eventually instructed to arrange themselves so that they never actually saw her. She would be in one room when they worked in another. When they needed to communicate, they communicated through notes slipped under doors. She spoke French to her staff, and only French, because she worried that English-speaking servants might repeat things they overheard. The apartment at 907 Fifth Avenue became a place of extraordinary privacy. 42 rooms, maintained at full readiness, tended by people who rarely, if ever, saw the woman for whom all of it was kept. She read the New York Times every morning. She watched television, the Flintstones, Rocky and Bullwinkle, the Forsyte Saga, the Dick Cavett Show. She used early recording technology, when it became available, to tape shows she liked, and she reportedly shipped 37 boxes of television recordings to her ex-husband, William Gower, who had moved to the south of France after their divorce, and with whom she had maintained an improbable distant connection. He sent back a grateful but somewhat startled note asking for customs documentation. She gave generously and continuously to people she cared about. She funded the bird refuge in Santa Barbara in memory of André. She gave money to museums and arts organizations and quietly helped individuals she read about in the newspaper who were struggling. She was not a bitter woman or a hard woman. She was, by all accounts, funny and warm in her phone conversations, curious about the world, interested in people's lives. She just didn't want to be in it. Her closest friend outside the apartment was a woman named Suzanne Pierre, who had once worked for her and who remained in contact for decades. Her goddaughter, Wanda Steicher, also stayed in touch. And when Wanda asked Huguette directly why she didn't go out anymore, Huguette told her simply that she didn't want to. There was no anguish in the statement, no appeal for understanding, just the plain declaration of a woman who had made her choice. What she could not do, in the years after her mother's death, was acknowledge the slow deterioration of her own body. She had no physician. She had no one who might notice the things that were quietly going wrong. By the late 1980s, she was in her 80s, and the consequences of decades without medical care were beginning to show. When she finally emerged, it was not by choice, it was by necessity. And the state in which she emerged would shock even the people who thought they already understood how thoroughly she had disappeared. Segment 5. The Hospital. A room with no exit. In March 1991, Huguette Clark was admitted to Doctors' Hospital on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. She was 84 years old, and she had not seen a physician in many years. What the medical staff encountered when she arrived was not easy to describe. She was severely underweight. Her face had been ravaged by basal cell carcinoma, a type of skin cancer that, left untreated for long enough, carves deep and disfiguring wounds into the tissue. One doctor described the lesions using language that left nothing to the imagination. She could not comfortably hold food in her mouth. The first nurse who encountered her described her as looking like an apparition, thin, undressed, disoriented in the way of someone who had not had reliable physical care in a very long time. She was, in her own estimation, deeply uncomfortable with how she looked. The surgery to repair the damage to her face was extensive, and it worked. The lesions were removed. Her face was reconstructed. Her health stabilized. She regained weight. Her doctors, led by a physician named Henry Singman, recommended strongly that she return home to her apartment. She refused, not because she was confused, not because she didn't understand what they were asking, but because she looked at that hospital room, the clean walls, the controlled environment, the nurses who came when called and asked nothing of her socially, the meals that appeared without negotiation, the world outside reduced to a window she could keep covered, and she recognized it as the place she wanted to be. She transferred to Beth Israel Medical Center when it merged with Doctors' Hospital, and she never left. She paid $829 per day to stay there, which worked out to approximately $400,000 per year, year after year, for the next 2 decades. Her room was on the 11th floor and had a view of Central Park that she kept permanently obscured. She lived under a false name, Harriet Chase, with a card taped over the actual room number bearing the designation 1B. The room was guarded. Very few people outside the immediate circle of her nurses and doctor knew where she was. She was, by the hospital's own account, a patient who needed very little medical intervention for most of her stay. She was not deteriorating in any significant way. She was simply living there, in a room, watching her shows, the Flintstones, the Smurfs, whatever she had recently recorded, and arranging her dolls and talking to her nurse in French. The nurse, who had been assigned to her at random, a registered nurse named Hadassah Perry, became the most significant relationship of Huguette's final 2 decades. Hadassah Perry worked 12-hour days for Huguette, sometimes more. She brought soup from home. She sat with Huguette through the long hours of the day and the early hours of the night. She described, in later testimony, working more hours in Huguette's room than in her own house, missing family vacations, missing her children growing up because Huguette didn't want her to leave. In return, Huguette gave Perry and her family gifts that accumulated over the years into something staggering: a Manhattan apartment, cars, payments for college tuitions, medical expenses, cash. By the end of Huguette's life, those gifts totaled over $30 million. The question of whether that relationship was one of genuine mutual affection, or exploitation in one direction or the other, or some complicated mixture of the two, became one of the central arguments of the legal battle that followed Huguette's death. Perry's defenders insisted that she had given Huguette genuine care and companionship in the only form Huguette could accept, and that Huguette had given the gifts freely, knowing exactly what she was doing because she wanted to. Huguette's relatives argued that an elderly woman in a hospital, cut off from family and the normal structures of life, was inherently vulnerable to the kind of influence that a constant, intimate caregiver can exert. What is certain is that Perry was at Huguette's side when she died. Whatever else can be said about their relationship, that part is uncomplicated. Meanwhile, 3 properties sat empty: a 42-room apartment on Fifth Avenue, a 27-room mansion on a cliff above the Pacific in Santa Barbara, a 52-acre estate in New Canaan, Connecticut, with 22 rooms, 9 bathrooms, 11 fireplaces, a wine cellar, and an elevator, purchased in 1952 as a potential refuge in the event of nuclear war, that Huguette had never once spent the night in after buying it. All of them maintained, all of them staffed, all of them kept in readiness for a woman who would never come. In Santa Barbara, the estate manager, John Douglas, spent 35 years overseeing Bellosguardo, keeping the gardens trimmed, the chandeliers clean, the leather-bound volumes of Dante and Homer turned periodically so they wouldn't warp. He described the property with something close to reverence. The portraits of André still hung 2 to a room. The piano still sat in the music room. The Stradivarius violins were still in their cases. Everything was where Huguette had left it in 1953, preserved across the decades like a room that expected its owner to walk back in at any moment. She never did, but she paid to keep it ready, every single month. Segment 4. The Mansions That Waited. What money kept alive? Bellosguardo cost $40,000 per month to maintain, not for extraordinary repairs, just to keep a 27-room oceanfront mansion clean, staffed, and in what Huguette specified as first-class condition. Across the decades, no one from the family set foot inside. The rose garden was tended. The library was dusted. The Renoir and Cézanne in the music room were properly maintained. Everything kept exactly as she had left it in 1953, because she paid for it to be kept that way. The apartment at 907 Fifth Avenue was similar. 2 full floors in one of Manhattan's most prestigious buildings, maintained by a staff who rarely saw their employer. And in Connecticut, a 52-acre estate purchased in 1952 specifically as a Cold War nuclear shelter, remote, invisible from the road, equipped for isolation, that Huguette had never once spent the night in after buying it. All 3 properties kept in readiness, year after year, decade after decade. In 2009, when Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Bill Dedman noticed the Connecticut estate listed for sale at $24 million, reduced from 35, and began investigating who owned it, his research eventually traced an elderly woman living in a Manhattan hospital room while these properties sat empty around her. When the story became public through NBC News beginning in 2010, the public reaction was bewilderment. People wanted an explanation that made sense. The answer, when a neurologist examined her in 2006, was quietly deflating. She was cognitively sound, cheerful, engaged, reading the Times, aware of the outside world, and choosing not to be in it. She had always hated being on display. The skin cancer that had sent her to the hospital in the first place had made that sensitivity physical and concrete. Even after reconstruction repaired her face, she would not go back outside. The illness had simply named the thing she had always felt. The mansions were not status symbols. They were security, options she was not yet ready to close. She was a woman who could not leave rooms behind, and so she kept all of them, year after year, on the chance that someday she might return. In 2005, after decades of her lawyers asking, she finally agreed to write a will. Segment 3. Two Wills and a Fortune. The Final Battle. By 2005, Huguette Clark was 98 years old. She had been living in Beth Israel Medical Center for 14 years. Her lawyer, a man named Wallace Bock, who had worked for her for 15 years, had been asking her for years to make legal arrangements for her estate. Her accountant, Irving Kamsler, had joined those requests. The matter was urgent in the way that such things become urgent when the person in question is approaching their 100th birthday and holds a fortune that conservative estimates placed at over $300 million. In March of 2005, she signed a will. It was a relatively straightforward document. It left $5 million to Hadassah Perry, and the remainder of the estate, by default, with no explicit bequests, to Huguette's relatives, the descendants of her father's children from his first marriage, a group of about 19 people who were Huguette's half-nieces and half-nephews and their own descendants. Most of them had never met her. The last time any of them had seen her in person was 1957. A few had sent Christmas cards to her apartment for years, year after year, without ever receiving a reply. 6 weeks later, she signed a second will. The second will was entirely different. It left nothing to the relatives. Instead, it directed the bulk of the estate, approximately 75%, to charity, primarily through the newly created Bello Sguardo Foundation, and a bequest to the Corcoran Gallery of Art. Hadassah Perry was to receive a further $30 million from the estate, in addition to the gifts she had already received during Huguette's lifetime. The goddaughter Wanda Steicher, daughter of Huguette's painting teacher Tade Steicher, and one of the very few people who had maintained genuine contact with Huguette through the years, was to receive approximately $12 million. Bock and Kamsler, the lawyer and accountant who had drafted the will, were each named to receive $500,000 and were appointed as executors of the estate and trustees of the new foundation, positions that would entitle them to additional fees. Beth Israel Medical Center was to receive $1 million. A Claude Monet painting from the Water Lilies series, purchased directly from the Bernheim Jeune Gallery in Paris in 1930 and not publicly displayed since 1925, was left to the Corcoran. When Huguette Clark died on May 24, 2011, 2 weeks before her 105th birthday, with Hadassah Perry at her side, 19 of her relatives emerged to contest the second will. Their argument was that Huguette had not been mentally capable of making her own decisions, and that the people around her, Perry, Bock, Kamsler, had used their access and her vulnerability to redirect her fortune. As evidence of mental incompetence, they cited her love of dolls, her passion for cartoons, her tendency to give money freely. Huguette's supporters responded that a woman who was lucid, engaged, reading the newspaper daily, and making detailed decisions about her art commissions and doll arrangements was not mentally incompetent, and that the idea of using someone's harmless eccentricities as proof of insanity was both legally questionable and personally insulting to her memory. The investigation that followed uncovered several uncomfortable facts. Kamsler, the accountant who had been entrusted with Huguette's affairs and was named as an executor in her will, had pleaded guilty in 2008, 3 years before her death, to attempting to disseminate indecent material to a minor online, a felony. He had remained in his position, managing Huguette's finances after this. Bock, the lawyer who drafted both wills, was both the draftsman and a beneficiary of the document, a combination that legal experts described as deeply problematic. The New York State Attorney General's office entered the case to represent the interests of the charities that stood to benefit from the second will. There were also reports of the hospital attempting to pressure Huguette into larger donations during her stay, suggestions that the institution had, over the years, sought to position itself advantageously with respect to her fortune. The hospital received its $1 million bequest in the settlement and faced ongoing legal action from the foundation and family to recover more. The Degas pastel that had apparently been stolen from her Fifth Avenue apartment shortly after she entered the hospital in the early 1990s, a work called Danseuse faisant des pointes, surfaced when the FBI began investigating it in 2005 and informed the Kansas City art collector, who had innocently purchased it years earlier, that it had likely been taken from Huguette's collection. That investigation ran separately from the estate dispute, but underscored that the years of Huguette's hospitalization had not been without exploitation. The settlement, reached in September 2013 on the eve of what had been scheduled to become a jury trial, divided the estate in a way that satisfied almost no one entirely. The 19 relatives received a total of $34.5 million. Perry received nothing from the will and agreed to return $5 million of the gifts she had received during Huguette's lifetime, while keeping the remaining $26 million or so. Bock and Kamsler forfeited their bequests and their executor appointments. The Corcoran Gallery received $10 million. The bulk of the remaining estate went to the Belos Guardo Foundation, along with the doll collection, valued at approximately $1.7 million, and the art. Belos Guardo itself, the 23-acre oceanfront mansion in Santa Barbara, was transferred to the foundation for the purpose of arts programming and public access, fulfilling what appeared to have been Huguette's genuine intention, that the house should be useful to people, not just maintained in perpetuity as a monument to a family that had ended. In 2023, Belos Guardo opened to the public for the first time. The chandeliers were cleaned. The piano was still in the music room. The portraits of André still watched from the walls. Segment 2. The woman inside the story. Who she was when no one was watching. For much of the public coverage of Huguette Clark's life and death, she was presented as a riddle, a pitiable eccentric manipulated out of her fortune, or a sad woman who had wasted her life. The coverage focused on the mansions, the dolls, the cartoons, the money, and the people fighting over it. The person at the center received considerably less attention. The people who actually talked to her described someone quite different. Paul Clark Newell Jr., a distant relative who maintained phone contact with her beginning in 1994, spoke with her regularly over nearly a decade. His account, formed into the biography Empty Mansions with Bill Dedman, described a woman who was lucid, warm, and genuinely engaged with a world she had chosen not to inhabit in person. She was funny. She asked thoughtful questions. She had made her choices and lived inside them with what appeared to be genuine contentment. When her goddaughter Wanda Steicher lost her own mother, Huguette told her that she must not live alone. She said it without irony. It was advice from someone who understood the cost of the choice she was describing. She was generous across her entire life in ways that went well beyond the $30 million given to her nurse. She found people in the newspaper who were struggling, and sent money. She kept the bird refuge named after André, funded by Huguette in 1928, maintained for nearly a century. She paid her employees well and gave Christmas gifts to the Bellosguardo staff she hadn't seen in decades. When the daughter of the estate manager wanted to walk through the house one more time, Huguette gave the order that she should be let in. The door was opened. The chandeliers were sparkling. Barbara Doran said she felt Huguette's presence there, more vivid for the physical absence than it might have been otherwise. Her father had told her no one would truly love her. Her sister had died before she could understand how to exist without her. Her marriage had been a transaction. The world had interrogated her, watched her, and eventually fought over her money. Through all of it, she had kept her apartment, her paintings, her dolls, her routines, and her sense of what made a day worth having. She was not broken by what happened to her. She was shaped by it, entirely and permanently, into something the world couldn't quite categorize and therefore couldn't quite leave alone. Segment 1. The Last Years and What Remains. Huguette Clark died on May 24th, 2011. She was 104 years old, early morning. The city already awake outside the window she had kept covered. In the weeks before, her condition had declined enough that she was moved to intensive care and then to hospice. Hadassah Perry, the nurse who had been at her side for nearly 20 years, was in the room when she died. There was no funeral. Huguette had long said she didn't want one, and she didn't want priests. A Catholic priest was summoned anyway to give last rites. On the morning of May 26th, before the cemetery gates opened to the public, she was interred in the family mausoleum in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, the same mausoleum where her father and her mother had been placed before her. She never made it back to Bellosguardo. She never stepped back into the apartment at 907 Fifth Avenue once she left for the hospital in 1991. The Connecticut estate, purchased as a Cold War shelter, remained unused through the full span of the Cold War and beyond, then sold. The Fifth Avenue apartments were sold. 2 units fetched $48 million combined. The estate settled in September 2013. The Bellosguardo Foundation took possession of the Santa Barbara property. In 2023, it opened to visitors. A portrait of André still hung on the wall. A doll collection worth nearly $2 million went to the foundation. 3 Stradivarius violins were catalogued and distributed. The Monet went to the Corcoran. The Degas that had been stolen from her apartment in the early 1990s was eventually returned to the estate by the collector who had unknowingly purchased it. The paintings she had made across her long life, portraits of women in kimonos, self-portraits, a Spanish dancer, a ballerina, were exhibited publicly in Santa Barbara in 2022 for the first time since 1931. People who attended noted that she was good, better than good, genuine talent used across a century. She was a woman who decided, early and finally, that the world was not a safe place to be fully present in. Given what the world had done to her, it is hard to argue she was wrong. She lived in a hospital room for 20 years, and by the only measure she cared about, was she living the way she wanted to? The answer was yes. The chandeliers at Bellosguardo were sparkling. The portraits were clean. The dolls were arranged exactly as she had specified. When she died, the world that had watched her from a distance finally stopped guessing and started looking at what she had actually left behind. It was more than anyone had realized. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.